March 1946. A temporary rehabilitation barracks somewhere inside a former wartime detention compound. The smell of disinfectant mixed with damp wood. Outside, boots crossed gravel slowly, no longer marching, just walking. Inside, rows of women sat at plain tables. Some wore donated coats too large for their shoulders. Others stared ahead, hands folded, eyes cautious. They had survived hunger, isolation, and years where even a scrap of paper had been forbidden or feared. An American relief worker placed a small stack on the table. Thin notebooks, cheap covers, a handful of fountain pens. No announcement followed. The women looked down but did not touch them. Blank pages felt dangerous. Writing had once meant interrogation, confession, punishment. Minutes passed. Then one woman reached forward, slowly, running her fingers across the paper, as if confirming it was real. Her breath caught. For the first time in years, someone was asking them not to stay silent, but to write. And behind that simple gesture lay the long road that had brought them here. By the spring of 1945, Europe was collapsing under its own weight. Allied armies pushed from west and east, German cities burned, and the machinery of the Third Reich began to fracture. Yet even as front lines shifted, millions of civilians and military personnel remained trapped inside a system built on discipline, secrecy, and fear. Among them were women, nurses, clerks, communications aides, factory workers attached to military units, and in some cases auxiliary staff assigned to administrative branches of the German war effort. Many were not combatants, but the chaos of retreat blurred distinctions. As Allied forces captured territory, these women found themselves swept into the massive movement of prisoners and displaced people that followed Germany's surrender in May 1945. For Allied commanders, the immediate challenge was logistical. Europe contained millions of former soldiers and civilians requiring screening, classification, and temporary housing. Camps appeared almost overnight. Some newly built, others converted from military depots, factories, or former prisoner facilities. Barbed wire remained, but the purpose was beginning to change. The war was over. Now came control, documentation, and stabilization. Female detainees presented a particular challenge. Many arrived exhausted, carrying little more than small bags or family photographs hidden inside clothing. Some had been separated from relatives during bombings or evacuations. Others had no clear idea whether their families were alive. The psychological atmosphere inside these camps was heavy. Years of total war had conditioned many Germans, especially those tied to military structures, to expect harsh treatment from the victors. Propaganda had warned them endlessly about enemy vengeance. When capture came without brutality, confusion replaced fear. American forces, guided by both military policy and growing awareness of post-war reconstruction, largely followed the Geneva Convention framework. Prisoners were fed, medically examined, and assigned routine. Yet something unexpected emerged in camps holding women or civilian auxiliaries. Silence. Many women avoided conversation, even among themselves. They complied with instructions, but rarely volunteered information beyond what was required. Trauma expressed itself through withdrawal. Some spent hours staring at walls or windows. Others clutched the few personal items they had managed to keep, especially photographs. Paper, however, was rare. During the war, written material had carried danger. Diaries could be confiscated. Letters were censored. Notes might be interpreted as political statements or evidence of disloyalty. Writing became associated with surveillance, authority, and risk. By the time captivity arrived, many women had gone years without freely writing anything personal. Allied camp administrators quickly recognized this emotional stagnation. Reports from medical officers described symptoms that would later be identified as psychological trauma, numbness, insomnia, emotional withdrawal, and a profound hesitation to express memory. At the same time, a larger political shift was unfolding. The United States and its allies were beginning to think beyond victory toward rebuilding Europe. Demilitarization alone would not be enough. Reconstruction required emotional reorientation, teaching former enemies to re-enter civilian life. In that environment, small gestures began to matter. Relief organizations, Red Cross workers, and civilian volunteers entered camps carrying supplies intended for basic stability: clothing, soap, books, and eventually something far less obvious but deeply symbolic: paper, pens, blank pages. And the moment those objects arrived would open a chapter no one inside the wire had expected. By late 1945 and into early 1946, the Allied occupation zones had begun transforming from wartime holding areas into controlled environments focused on reintegration. The immediate violence had ended, but Europe remained unstable. Cities lay in ruin. Rail lines barely functioned. Families were scattered across borders that no longer looked the same as they had before the war. Inside prisoner and civilian internment camps, routine became the central tool of stability. Wake-up calls, meals, medical checks, roll calls, each structured to replace chaos with predictability. Yet routine alone could not restore identity. For many female detainees, identity itself felt suspended. They were no longer soldiers' assistants or workers supporting the wartime system. Yet they were not civilians in the ordinary sense either. Their past roles carried shame or uncertainty. Their future was unknown. American camp reports from this period noted a recurring pattern among women detainees: silence layered over compliance. They followed rules carefully, but avoided emotional engagement. Some resisted speaking about their experiences altogether. Others seemed unable to articulate them. Military psychologists and chaplains working in camps began experimenting with modest rehabilitation efforts, not formal therapy, which barely existed in modern form, but activities meant to encourage expression. Reading circles appeared. Language classes were tested. Small art projects were permitted in certain camps where security concerns were minimal. And then came writing. The idea was simple. Civilian aid organizations argued that personal writing could help detainees process events and maintain mental stability. Notebooks and pens were inexpensive, easy to distribute, and required no supervision beyond basic rules. Writing could remain private, something rare after years of surveillance and propaganda. But even this decision was debated. Some military administrators worried that private writing might encourage political messaging or hidden communication. Others countered that denying expression would only prolong emotional instability. Eventually, policies softened. In lower security camps, controlled distribution of notebooks and writing tools was approved. When the supplies arrived, they were unremarkable by appearance. Plain covers, cheap paper, standard fountain pens or pencils issued in small bundles. Yet for many women, the objects felt almost foreign. The act of touching blank paper carried weight. During wartime, paper had often meant orders, ration cards, or official documents stamped with authority. A page intended purely for personal thought, without censorship, without expectation, was something they had not known for years. Observers later recalled how hesitant many women were to accept the materials at first. Some held the notebooks but didn't open them. Others turned pages slowly, testing the texture with cautious fingers, as if afraid it might be taken away again. Then gradually, writing began. Not all at once, not loudly, quietly. At night, between bunks, during moments when guards passed without interruption. Names were written first, repeated over and over as though confirming existence. Then memories, addresses half remembered, lists of family members, fragments of songs, descriptions of cities that no longer existed as they had known them. The notebooks became more than supplies, they became anchors. And as the first words appeared on those pages, camp staff began noticing changes, subtle shifts in posture, in conversation, in the way women looked at one another. Something buried beneath exhaustion was beginning to move again. The next phase of this story would not be defined by policy or logistics, but by perspective, by the many different angles through which a simple notebook and pen transformed a moment in post-war history.
For many of the women inside Allied camps, the notebook was not merely a tool, it was evidence, proof that they still existed as individuals. The war had reduced identities to categories: prisoner, displaced person, enemy civilian. Personal histories had been swallowed by mass movement and bureaucratic labels. The first lines written were rarely dramatic. Camp observers later described pages filled with repetitive handwriting, names written again and again, birthplaces, dates, family lists, simple sentences confirming memory. This pattern reflected something deeper than habit. Psychologists now recognize it as a grounding behavior, an attempt to rebuild identity through repetition. Without uniforms, without roles, without certainty of the future, writing became a way to reclaim continuity with the past. Some women wrote about homes that had already been destroyed. Others described mothers or siblings whose fate remained unknown. The pages contained uncertainty, but also persistence. American chaplains assigned to certain camps noted that once women began writing privately, emotional volatility inside barracks often decreased. Arguments lessened, sleep improved. Small conversations emerged around shared experiences, not forced by officials, but naturally growing from individuals rediscovering their own voices. In one camp report from early 1946, a supervising officer remarked that written journals appeared to reduce what he called withdrawn resignation. Women who had previously avoided contact started exchanging small observations, comparing handwriting, or quietly asking one another for words in foreign languages. Writing did not erase trauma, but it offered structure. For the first time in years, memory belonged to the individual instead of the state. And that quiet return of ownership began reshaping camp dynamics from the inside outward. From the American administrative viewpoint, providing notebooks and pens fit into a broader post-war strategy, though few policymakers would have predicted the emotional impact. Occupation authorities faced a complex challenge. Europe needed rebuilding, but psychological stability among displaced populations was equally important. Camps filled with silent, emotionally exhausted civilians presented long-term risks if unresolved trauma hardened into resentment or instability. The solution was not always grand programs. Often it was small, human-scale interventions: music, education, reading materials, and writing supplies. Documents from occupation-era welfare organizations show a growing belief that personal expression could support reintegration. Unlike political lectures or ideological materials, notebooks carried no explicit message. They represented choice. Women could write letters never sent, record dreams, practice languages, or simply stare at blank pages until ready. To many American workers, especially civilian volunteers and Red Cross staff, this approach reflected democratic principles. The freedom to write privately symbolized a contrast with authoritarian regimes where expression had been controlled or censored. Some administrators even noted practical benefits. Written reflections sometimes helped detainees communicate medical needs or personal histories that translators struggled to uncover through interviews alone. Yet the most significant outcome wasn't measurable in reports. Guards described a change in atmosphere, barracks that once felt heavy with silence now carrying quiet sounds of paper turning, pens scratching, occasional whispers. The objects themselves were ordinary, but what they represented was revolutionary inside a space defined by captivity. By giving women the ability to write, authorities unintentionally allowed them to rewrite how they understood their own survival. And as this transformation unfolded, a deeper layer emerged, one shaped by culture, dignity, and the fragile psychology of recovery after total war.
By late 1945 and into early 1946, the Allied occupation zones had begun transforming from wartime holding areas into controlled environments focused on reintegration. The immediate violence had ended, but Europe remained unstable. Cities lay in ruin. Rail lines barely functioned. Families were scattered across borders that no longer looked the same as they had before the war. Inside prisoner and civilian internment camps, routine became the central tool of stability. Wake-up calls, meals, medical checks, roll calls, each structured to replace chaos with predictability. Yet routine alone could not restore identity. For many female detainees, identity itself felt suspended. They were no longer soldiers' assistants or workers supporting the wartime system. Yet they were not civilians in the ordinary sense either. Their past roles carried shame or uncertainty. Their future was unknown. American camp reports from this period noted a recurring pattern among women detainees. Silence layered over compliance. They followed rules carefully, but avoided emotional engagement. Some resisted speaking about their experiences altogether. Others seemed unable to articulate them. Military psychologists and chaplains working in camps began experimenting with modest rehabilitation efforts, not formal therapy, which barely existed in modern form, but activities meant to encourage expression. Reading circles appeared. Language classes were tested. Small art projects were permitted in certain camps where security concerns were minimal. And then came writing. The idea was simple. Civilian aid organizations argued that personal writing could help detainees process events and maintain mental stability. Notebooks and pens were inexpensive, easy to distribute, and required no supervision beyond basic rules. Writing could remain private, something rare after years of surveillance and propaganda. But even this decision was debated. Some military administrators worried that private writing might encourage political messaging or hidden communication. Others countered that denying expression would only prolong emotional instability. Eventually, policies softened. In lower security camps, controlled distribution of notebooks and writing tools was approved. When the supplies arrived, they were unremarkable by appearance. Plain covers, cheap paper, standard fountain pens or pencils issued in small bundles. Yet for many women, the objects felt almost foreign. The act of touching blank paper carried weight. During wartime, paper had often meant orders, ration cards, or official documents stamped with authority. A page intended purely for personal thought, without censorship, without expectation, was something they had not known for years. Observers later recalled how hesitant many women were to accept the materials at first. Some held the notebooks but didn't open them. Others turned pages slowly, testing the texture with cautious fingers, as if afraid it might be taken away again. Then gradually, writing began. Not all at once, not loudly, quietly. At night, between bunks, during moments when guards passed without interruption. Names were written first, repeated over and over as though confirming existence. Then memories, addresses half remembered, lists of family members, fragments of songs, descriptions of cities that no longer existed as they had known them. The notebooks became more than supplies, they became anchors. And as the first words appeared on those pages, camp staff began noticing changes, subtle shifts in posture, in conversation, in the way women looked at one another. Something buried beneath exhaustion was beginning to move again. The next phase of this story would not be defined by policy or logistics, but by perspective, by the many different angles through which a simple notebook and pen transformed a moment in post-war history. Spring 1946. Across multiple American, POW and civilian internment camps, something subtle began to spread. Not through orders or official announcements, but through observation. Women who had once sat motionless during daylight hours now gathered quietly around tables. Pens scratched softly against paper, heads bent close together as if protecting a fragile secret. The shift was small enough to miss. But camp personnel noticed. At one camp in the American Southwest, a translator recorded in her notes that women who previously refused conversation were now asking how to spell English words. Another report mentioned prisoners requesting extra paper, not for petitions or complaints, but for continued writing. The notebooks had stopped being objects. They had become routines. Morning sunlight filtered through barrack windows as women wrote before breakfast. Some composed letters they might never send. Others copied poems remembered from school years before the war. A few carefully recreated family trees, afraid memories might disappear if not documented. For the first time since capture, many were shaping time instead of being controlled by it. American administrators, initially uncertain about allowing unrestricted writing, debated the practice. Some worried about coded messages or political material. Yet inspections revealed mostly personal reflections, memories of home, grief for lost relatives, observations about weather, or simple accounts of daily life. The decision came quietly. The writing would continue. This moment marked a psychological turning point. Until then, captivity had defined identity. The women were prisoners first, individuals second. But as writing spread, the order began to reverse. Stories replaced numbers, names replaced roles. In one documented account from a camp in Texas, a woman who had barely spoken for weeks asked a guard for a sharper pencil. The request itself startled staff. It signaled not resistance, but investment. She cared about clarity, about expression. Writing groups formed spontaneously. One woman would read a sentence aloud. Others nodded or smiled faintly. Shared laughter appeared in places previously governed by silence. The notebooks also changed relationships with guards. Conversations shifted from commands to small exchanges, spelling questions, requests for extra pages, curiosity about English phrases. The guards, often young men unfamiliar with Japanese culture, began to see the prisoners differently, not as enemies, but as people rebuilding themselves through words. A Red Cross worker later wrote that she noticed women folding pages carefully before sleeping, placing notebooks beneath pillows like protective charms. In camps where personal possessions were few, these pages became emotional anchors. Yet the transformation was not without tension. Some women hesitated to write openly, fearing judgment from their own peers. Others struggled with guilt. Was it acceptable to find comfort in captivity? Could healing coexist with loyalty to the past? These internal conflicts surfaced on paper. Lines were crossed out, pages torn, then rewritten. The struggle to define identity continued, but now it had a visible form. One evening, during a routine inspection, a camp nurse witnessed something she would later describe as the moment she understood the impact of the notebooks. A group of women sat silently together, each writing under dim light. No supervision was required, no instructions given. They were simply present with themselves. The war had forced obedience. Writing introduced choice. And choice, once awakened, could not easily be taken away. As weeks passed, camp leadership realized that discipline problems had declined. Anxiety appeared reduced. Medical complaints related to sleeplessness lessened in some reports. Though no formal studies were conducted at the time, the pattern was unmistakable. The simple act of writing had altered the emotional atmosphere of the camps. What began as a gesture of kindness was now reshaping behavior, identity, and memory itself. But the most powerful change was still ahead, the moment when words left the notebook pages and began traveling beyond the fences, transforming prisoners into voices heard once again. By late spring 1946, the notebooks were no longer just private spaces. They began creating connections beyond the barracks. Some camp administrators, encouraged by Red Cross workers and civilian volunteers, allowed selected writings to be translated. The intention was cautious. Officials wanted to understand emotional conditions inside the camps. But what emerged was something unexpected. The pages did not contain military secrets. They contained longing, letters never sent to mothers in ruined cities, descriptions of cherry blossoms remembered from childhood, questions about whether home still existed at all, quiet reflections on shame, survival, and uncertainty. Translators, many of them bilingual Japanese Americans who had endured their own wartime displacement, found themselves deeply affected by the writing. They noted how carefully many women chose words, avoiding politics and focusing on simple human details: weather, food, memories, dreams. A translator at a California camp later recalled that one notebook entry described the feel of holding a warm teacup after years without comfort. Another spoke only about rain, pages dedicated to the sound it made against roof wood because it reminded the writer of home. These fragments began circulating among aid organizations, not publicly at first, quietly, shared between social workers and chaplains who argued that writing should be encouraged further. They believed it reduced emotional strain and prepared prisoners psychologically for repatriation. Inside the camps, the effect intensified. Women who once guarded their silence now exchanged notebooks to read each other's pages. Some corrected grammar, others added small illustrations in margins: mountains, flowers, family symbols. The act of writing had become communal. And then something crossed an invisible line. A small number of women asked if they could send their writing outward. Not official letters, but messages. Simple expressions of gratitude or questions directed toward civilian volunteers who had provided the materials. The request created hesitation. Military protocol was strict. Communications were monitored heavily. But after review, limited exchanges were approved under supervision. When the first responses returned, the emotional impact was immediate. American civilians, teachers, church members, students wrote back. They responded not to enemies, but to stories. They spoke about their own families, their own losses during the war, their hopes for peace. The women read these replies slowly, often aloud in small groups. For many, it was the first time they experienced dialogue without hostility since capture. One guard later described entering a barrack to find several women silently passing around a letter written in careful, simple language. I cannot imagine what you have been through, but I hope writing helps you feel seen. No one spoke, but many were crying. The notebooks had crossed the fence. This was the true turning point, not a dramatic event, not a formal policy announcement, but a shift in emotional reality. The women were no longer isolated voices writing into silence. Someone was reading. Camp reports from mid-1946 noted increased participation in educational programs, improved morale, and fewer disciplinary concerns among groups involved in writing sessions. Though military terminology described these outcomes as stabilization, those who witnessed the changes recognized something deeper. The notebooks had restored authorship. These women were not merely survivors of war, they were storytellers of it. Even guards felt the change. Interactions softened, questions replaced commands. In several camps, guards began asking translators what the women were writing about, curious, sometimes visibly moved by the humanity revealed on the pages. One officer remarked privately that the notebooks accomplished what lectures never could. They allowed prisoners to process defeat without humiliation. The writing did not erase grief. It did not heal every wound. But it created movement where stagnation had existed. And as repatriation schedules approached, the notebooks became precious possessions. Pages were folded carefully, hidden within clothing, or packed beside the few personal belongings allowed on the journey home. Because by then, everyone understood something quietly profound. These pages were proof that even in captivity, even after loss, a voice could survive, and that survival would shape everything that followed once the fences finally opened. By the late summer of 1946, repatriation orders moved quickly. Ships were assigned. Names were checked again and again against camp rosters. The long process of returning prisoners to Europe and Asia entered its final phase. For the women who had filled notebooks during captivity, departure carried complicated emotions. Relief existed, but so did fear. Germany itself no longer resembled the country many remembered. Cities lay shattered by bombing campaigns. Infrastructure had collapsed. Families were scattered across occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Many prisoners had no clear idea whether their homes still stood or whether anyone waited for them. Inside the camps, preparations were orderly. Medical checks, clothing distribution, transport lists. The notebooks, however, fell outside official procedure. They were neither military documents nor contraband. Guards often looked the other way, as women folded them into small bundles of belongings, tucked inside coats, wrapped within blankets, or hidden among letters and photographs. What had started as simple writing supplies had become personal archives. Some women chose to tear pages from notebooks and share them before departure. Small poems, messages of gratitude, sketches passed quietly between bunkmates who feared they might never meet again after ships sailed. Witnesses described farewell scenes that felt subdued rather than dramatic. There were few tears in public. Years of discipline remained deeply ingrained, but many clutched the notebooks tightly, as though holding on to the last stable piece of their wartime identity. American administrators noticed something unexpected. Compared with earlier prisoner groups, many women who participated in writing programs showed greater emotional stability during departure processing. Camp psychologists, still using language shaped by wartime thinking, described them as better adjusted to transition. Today, historians interpret this differently. Writing had allowed reflection, and reflection prepared them to face uncertainty. When transports departed, guards watched rows of women carrying small bags onto trucks or trains. Some nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact, still unsure how to interpret kindness from former enemies. Yet in the silence of departure, the notebooks traveled with them. Once back in Europe, the reality of post-war life struck quickly. Food shortages were severe. Housing was scarce. Civilian populations struggled under occupation rules and political restructuring. Returning women faced suspicion from communities unfamiliar with the experience of captivity. Many avoided speaking about their time in camps altogether, and so the notebooks remained private. Some were hidden in drawers, others were wrapped in cloth and stored in trunks. A few women burned parts of their writing, afraid the words might be misunderstood in a society desperate to move forward. But many kept them intact. Decades later, historians interviewing former POWs discovered that these notebooks often became silent witnesses to memory, pages revisited during moments of loneliness, marriage, motherhood, or old age. They contained thoughts written in a rare liminal space between war and peace. For American guards and aid workers, the aftermath felt quieter but equally lasting. Letters occasionally arrived through Red Cross channels, short notes thanking them for pencils, paper, or kindness shown inside camps. No medals were awarded for the act of giving notebooks. No military records marked it as significant. Yet those who participated understood that something unusual had happened, something measured not in victories, but in voices restored. And as the women stepped back into a broken Europe, carrying pages filled behind barbed wire, history moved forward, leaving those fragile notebooks to bridge the space between captivity and memory. In the years that followed, the notebooks faded from public view. Post-war Europe had little space for private reflection. Nations rebuilt quickly. New political divisions hardened into the Cold War. Public narratives focused on reconstruction, tribunals, and economic survival, not on the quiet emotional recovery of former female prisoners. Many women returned to ordinary lives. Some became teachers or nurses again. Others married, raised children, and rarely mentioned their months or years in captivity. The notebooks remained hidden artifacts of an experience that felt difficult to explain because it did not match popular expectations of war. When they spoke of American camps at all, their stories often sounded contradictory to listeners. They described barbed wire and uncertainty, but also moments of unexpected dignity. They described being enemies, yet being handed paper, pens, and the freedom to write. For decades, historians overlooked these details. Most official military archives focused on strategy, logistics, and combat outcomes. Psychological rehabilitation programs received little attention, especially those involving women. Only during oral history projects in the 1970s and 1980s did fragments of the story begin to surface. Researchers discovered notebooks preserved in family attics, libraries, and personal collections. Some pages contained poetry, others were practical diaries listing weather, meals, or daily routines. Many included drawings, barracks windows, laundry lines, distant guard towers. A few contained entries written in multiple languages, reflecting attempts to learn English words or translate phrases heard from American staff. What struck historians most was the tone. There was very little propaganda, almost no political grandstanding. Instead, there was introspection. Women wrote about identity, shame, survival, and uncertainty. Several described how writing helped them regain a sense of control at a time when nearly every decision had been made for them. American veterans who later reflected on camp service also remembered those moments differently as they aged. In interviews, some described the simple act of handing out notebooks as one of the few times during military duty when they felt they were helping rather than fighting. One former guard recalled that silence inside the barracks changed after writing began. Where there had been tension and withdrawal, there were now quiet conversations and occasional laughter. He admitted he did not understand it then, only later realizing that the women were rebuilding their inner lives. The broader historical effect was subtle, but real. Post-war reconciliation between former enemies often focused on diplomatic treaties or economic recovery. Yet these small human exchanges, pencils passed across ideological boundaries, helped form emotional foundations that politics alone could not create. No single notebook altered history, but collectively they offered something rare, first-hand evidence of how dignity can return gradually through ordinary tools rather than grand gestures. And perhaps that is why many survived, not because they were intended for historians, but because their owners could not bear to throw them away. They represented proof that even in confinement, the human voice endured. By the time scholars began studying them seriously, many writers were already elderly. Some said they rarely reread what they had written. Others admitted they did. Quietly, alone, turning pages worn thin by decades. Each notebook told the same quiet truth. War had taken much, but writing had given something back. And from that quiet aftermath, the story moves toward its final reflection, where memory becomes meaning, and small acts reveal their lasting weight. Wars are often remembered through explosions, uniforms, and maps drawn in red and blue. Yet history rarely pauses long enough to notice the quiet moments, the ones without gunfire, without speeches, without victory parades. Inside post-war camps, the simple act of giving a notebook and a pen carried a weight no one fully understood at the time. For the American soldiers and civilian staff, it was practical, a routine gesture. Something small enough to seem insignificant in the shadow of global conflict. For the women who received them, it was something else entirely. Paper represented voice, choice, identity. Many of these prisoners came from worlds where surrender meant silence, where captivity erased status and purpose. Writing allowed them to reclaim a space that war had taken away, the private space of thought. They were still behind fences, still uncertain about their future, but once the pen touched paper, they were no longer only prisoners. They became witnesses, observers, human beings telling their own stories in their own words. History often celebrates grand strategies and decisive battles. Yet the rebuilding of dignity happens quietly, page by page, sentence by sentence, long after the fighting ends. Some notebooks disappeared. Some survived in drawers and dusty boxes. Others were passed to children who never fully understood why their mothers or grandmothers kept them so carefully. But together, they reveal something essential about the aftermath of war. Victory is loud, recovery is quiet, and sometimes the most lasting change begins not with commands or treaties, but with a blank page offered to someone who had almost forgotten they were allowed to speak. In the end, the notebooks were not simply tools. They were proof that even after total collapse, the human voice can return, slowly, carefully, and stubbornly alive.